Hello, my name is Diego Alberto, and today I'm going to present the first part of my project of Análisis de Incertidumbre, which consists of the 1500 data taken from INEGI on the year 2022. So the objective of this project mainly is to look and analyze, as I mentioned before, the data proportioned by INEGI and on the census made on the year 2022 that collects data about perceptions of various relevant topics to the Mexican population, and consequently give an interpretation and remark the most important conclusions from this analysis made, and furthermore give a dive more into the topic. So first, we're gonna have a little introduction. So our source taken was as I mentioned before, INEGI Open Data from 2022. The data size was 1,500 from more than 10,000 records that were taken in two accountants. So the software was Minitab, which was used to create all of our resources, such as graphs and raw data. And our focus is, as I mentioned before, is on the quantitative variable of age and other qualitative variables, such as the sex, state, country, security, perception, stratum, etc. And the main purpose is to identify the trends by demographic characteristics in certain topics that are relevant to dive more into. Now, first, we're going to go into the quantitative analysis of age. We're going to have firstly our general statistics. As we are able to appreciate, we have our mean, our standard deviation, our first quartile, our third quartile, our median, and our skewness, which is 0.45, and our kurtosis, which is minus 0.52. So the interpretation of this is we can see that there's a right skewed on this case of the age, which also shows that these respondents are mainly younger adults with a mean age of 34 years. We can also see in our histogram that the ages in which the people are interviewed are mainly starting from 25 years up until the 55 years, which we can see right here. So it's a roundabout. We can see that there's like a higher peak on people around these ages. So we can assume that there's the general population is conformed by mainly people from these ages. Now, the cumulative relative frequency of age. We can see that there's an increasing tendency, which we can also appreciate that starts at the age 25 and approximately again at age 55 starts to decrease, or it doesn't grow as much as it grew before. So we can confirm furthermore what we said before. And now the box plot. We can see, as I mentioned, that there's a slight skew to the right. So we can confirm it with this box plot, and that's like our confirmation. Now, the relative parameters of the qualitative analysis. First, we have our bar graph of gender, which shows that there's almost equality on the people from which they were taking the data from, but however, there's more women on this case that were interviewed and surveyed rather than men. Now we can see the stratum. As we can see, there's a high concentration of people or data on the second stratum, which belongs to the lower middle stratum, consisting more than 50% of the population who were interviewed on this case. Now the NADT, we can see that they are pretty much equal. There's higher peaks, but mainly we can see a higher peak on number 9, which is the one corresponding to Chiapas, where there's more concentration of people who were surveyed on this case. Now, the insecurity worries. We can see that there's bigger insecurity worries on the population rather than the proper population feeling safe. So that's something we can remark and dive more into on why does this happen and why does people feel like more insecure rather than secure. So now, first we have our corruption worries. We can see that the people have very few, or there's not much corruption worries, with more than the 60% people surveyed don't think it was a big worry. So that's something we can we don't take into account. And the lack of punishment to criminals. We can see again that there's not a high concern, with more than 80% of the surveyed don't feeling like there's a necessity to um, have different punishment to criminals, or that there's a lack of punishment. So that's something we don't have to concentrate on furthermore. Now we can see firstly the perception of security under state. We can see that more than 66% of the population don't feel safe, which shows a clear deficiency on the system on security wise. So there's something we can furthermore analyze and see, why does this happen? Why do people don't feel safe on their own state? Now we can see the security on public transportation. Again, we can see that there's a feeling of insecurity, with almost half of the people surveyed don't feeling safe enough on the public transportation. Now we can go to the perception of security on the road. We can see that it's a pretty level tendency on this case. However, people rather feel more insecure than secure. So that's something again that shows a deficiency on the system that needs to be furthermore analyzed on why does people feel less secure on the road. And now the feeling that they can be or either kidnapped or extortioned. We can see that the graph again shows that there's more people who feel they are more perceptible to getting either kidnapped or extorted. So that's another deficiency that needs to be furthermore analyzed. And now we can go into the state police. We can see that on this case it shows something unexpected. People don't want to answer this question, or they don't feel safe. So we can see that something's off about this. People don't want to answer the question, maybe because people don't feel safe on telling that they don't feel good or comfortable with the state police, and they are scared to be threatened. So that's something we can furthermore dive into and ask why. Why does this happen? And again, this happens on the same on the corruption on the state police. Again, a lot of people don't want to answer the question. So that's something we can furthermore dive into. Now, we can go to the trust in the National Guard. We can see that mainly the surveyed feel that there's a high trust on the National Guard, so that's something positive. People rather feel safe with the National Guard in comparison to the state police. And in the corruption in the National Guard, there's another, once again, there's not high perception of corruption within the National Guard. So that's something positive to take into account. And now we go with the Army. There's a high perception of security and trust in the Army organization amongst the overall population that were surveyed. So that's something positive. We can appreciate it in the first two graphs. And we can go to the perception of corruption in the Army. We can see that there's not much corruption, or there's not that much perception of corruption, at least on the Army. More than half of the opinion is that there's practically no corruption. And finally, we're gonna have our age comparison with quantitative and our qualitative analysis with Stratus. First, we're gonna have our general statistics of the age, our quantitative data against our stratum, our qualitative data. We're gonna have a 4 stratus. We're gonna see that practically the first 2 stratus have the same data roughly. They don't change that much at all. They have very slight differences. However, when we go into, or when we dive into the last 2 stratus, we can see that there's a high difference between the first 2 and the last 2 blocks of the stratus. So that's something we can analyze and dive more into on why there's like this high difference between people, and that's something to get more invested into. And now we're gonna have our box plot of age against stratum. All of these stratums mark that there's a skew mainly again towards the right, such as the previous skew of age, which means that the stratus isn't affected at all by age. So the people that conform all of the stratums are on average the same age as the average age. And now we can go up the histogram of age against stratum. Again, we can confirm that this stratum, the dominant stratum, is the second stratum with almost all of our graphs marking with the pink color that the second stratum is the mainly dominant one on this case. So we can see that there's no changes on this case of age gaps at all within the stratum. So that's something we can analyze, that people mainly are conformed by the lower middle class on Mexico at least. So our final conclusions: as the data made appreciable in comparison to the census, general population consists of mainly people ages around 20 until 60, which is a clear tendency of these surveys too. We can see also that there's a lot of changes that need to be done in order to attain a different and better perception in organizations such as the state police in conception of the security. And finally, in conclusion of our comparison, the analysis led to the knowledge of how this stratum doesn't seem to affect independently of the age. And that was our final conclusion. And these were my sources, and thank you for watching.